Hello, my name is Sonali and I welcome you all to this week's Sunday special episode of Around the World in 7 Days. When we hear the mention of Vietnam and America, the same picture of the 5-6 decades old Vietnam War comes to our mind, in which America and Russia were fighting with each other. America had to face defeat in that war that lasted for nearly 20 years and ultimately it was disappointed. But it is not that America ended its relations with Vietnam. From 1994-95, relations between the two countries gradually started improving and their former relations began. Today we are discussing this because Vietnam and America are moving towards improving their bilateral relations. According to media reports, both the countries are going to sign an agreement this month. The agreement will boost Vietnam's efforts to develop high-technology sectors in the region, including semiconductor production and artificial intelligence, as part of new bilateral cooperation. In fact, for the past few months, the Biden administration has been pushing to elevate relations with Vietnam to a strategic partnership and plans to do all this on the 10th anniversary of the establishment of the current comprehensive partnership. US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin and Vice President Kamala Harris both talked about improving relations during recent visits to Vietnam. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said during a visit to Vietnam in April that formal ties could be further enhanced in the coming days. In today's episode, we will talk about the old tensions between Vietnam and America. We will understand how relations between the two countries improved. Besides, we will also see what are the reasons behind America's growing closeness to Vietnam. First of all, let us see the geographical location of Vietnam. Vietnam is a country located in the southeast of Asia. Its northern border is with China, while its western border is with Laos and Cambodia. It shares a maritime border with Thailand through the Gulf of Thailand. It also shares maritime border with Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia through South China Sea. Its capital is Hanoi, which is located in the north. As far as the tension between Vietnam and America is concerned, it is several decades old. This is after the Second World War, when the whole world was divided into two groups. One camp was led by the United States and the other by the Soviet Union. On one hand, America wanted to impose its capitalist ideology, while on the other hand, the Soviet Union was engaged in spreading its communist ideology. This was the period when the entire world was facing the Cold War and the geopolitical tension between America and the Soviet Union was at its peak. Both these countries were fighting each other for their supremacy, and the countries of the world were becoming the arena of this war. North Vietnam and South Vietnam were also two such countries. Although the war took place between these two countries, America and Russia demonstrated power in it. Actually, the First Indochina War took place in 1946 after French control of Indochina. By 1950, this fight became associated with the Cold War. The war ended when the French army surrendered on May 7, 1954. After the end of the war, a conference was held in Geneva, Switzerland from April to July in 1954. In this agreement, the entire areas occupied by France were liberated and divided into several parts. Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam were separated. There was no problem regarding Cambodia and Laos, but there were issues regarding partition of Vietnam. Actually, in this agreement, Vietnam was temporarily divided into two parts, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. The northern part was to be governed by the Viet Minh led by Ho Chi Minh and the southern part by the state of Vietnam led by former Emperor Bao Dai. It stipulated that a general election would be held by July 1956 to form a unified Vietnamese state. But South Vietnam and America refused to accept this agreement. Later, South Vietnam also refused to hold elections, and this led to the Vietnam War. The war officially started on 1st November 1955 and ended on 30 April 1975. In the mid to late 1980s, a change began to occur as Vietnam began economic reforms and tried to reduce its dependence on the faltering Soviet Union. With the easing and end of the Cold War, George H.W. Bush administration took the opportunity to bring about a peace settlement in Cambodia, and the two governments began negotiations. In 1991, after much internal debate, the Bush administration offered Vietnam a roadmap toward normalization. Refugees were allowed to travel to the United States, and humanitarian aid to the United States and Washington was increased. The United States provided humanitarian aid to Vietnam and eased restrictions on Vietnamese diplomats to the United Nations. Restrictions on travel to Vietnam for American citizens was also eased. In 1993, then US President Clinton opened the first US State Department office in Hanoi. Since then, relations between the two countries started warming up. Now the question is, why America felt the need to establish relations with Vietnam? Shared concern over China is an important factor in US-Vietnam relations. China became increasingly assertive in the South China Sea, and the concerns of both America and Vietnam increased. Regular dialogue between the two countries on security matters began in the early 2000s. Gradually, the cooperation increased. America is also uncomfortable by China's growing dominance in the Indo-Pacific. In such a situation, to challenge China's dominance, it needs a partner in this region, and Vietnam is one of them. America is wooing not only Vietnam but also other countries of Southeast Asia which do not have cordial relations with China. The recent agreements and warmth in relations also need to be seen in this context. The US is essentially trying to enlist allies in a campaign to isolate a nation it views as a threat to US supremacy in the region. However, Vietnam is seeing it in the sense that as part of its foreign policy, it has to include major powers in its fold, and that is what it is doing. Now it is the turn of this program's Sunday special segment, in which we will delve into other significant international news. India has invited the African Union to become a full member of the G20 before the G20 summit to be held under the chairmanship of India. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi announced this during the Business 20 summit held in Delhi. Let us tell you that the G20 group includes 19 countries and the European Union. These members make up about 85% of global GDP and 2/3 of the world's population, but the grouping includes only one country from the continent of Africa, that is South Africa. And the African Union has a total of 55 members. However, 5 nations are currently suspended due to military rule. The headquarters of the African Union is in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. The series of military coups in African countries is showing off halt. Now the name of Central African country Gabon has also been added to this list. This step has been taken after the recently concluded elections in Gabon. The election was won by the Bongo Gabonese Democratic Party, which has been in power for more than 50 years. There was an allegation of rigging in this election. Shortly after the Election Commission announced the victory of the Bongs, it was announced that the military would take power. Let us tell you that a few years ago, a coup attempt was also made in Gabon, although it could not be successful. Australia is soon going to have a historic referendum. If approved, Australia's constitution could change for the first time in 50 years. After the approval of the plebiscite, a body will be formed which will work to give advice on the laws for the indigenous people of the country. It is believed that this body will be a positive step towards improving the lives of the native Australians. However, its approval is considered difficult. So far, only 8 out of 44 such proposals have been successful. So that's all in this discussion. See you in the next episode. But before leaving, let's note down a practice question based on today's coverage. What are the reasons for the warming up of relations between Vietnam and America?